I'd like to talk to you about different types of tests and assessments that you might develop as a teacher or that your students might encounter in their path towards greater proficiency. There's a wide variety of different test types, and it's very helpful to know about the different names for the different types of them so that you have a better understanding of the characteristics of each test type. One way of thinking about this or organizing your thoughts in this way is to think about the kinds of tests that your students might encounter in their typical pathway towards school, perhaps in Canada or in the United States or in any kind of English medium university or college. So let's assume that we have a student in China and they want to come to Canada to study, and probably the first thing they'll need to do is to write a TOEFL or an IELTS test. And these are, you probably recognize, these are the names of the very big standardized proficiency tests. So that's one type of test. A standardized test typically measures proficiency across a variety of student skills. So they should measure reading, writing, listening, and speaking, and in a variety of different contexts. And they provide a score that usually goes to the institution. The student gets the score as well, but the score is then delivered to the college or the university to which the student is applying, and then the administrators at the institution use that to determine whether the student is a good candidate for admission or not. So that is the standardized proficiency test. So let's say that the student passes that test, or what I should say is gets a high enough score to be admitted to an English medium university. And so the student makes all the arrangements and does travel to Canada and arrives in your school or your institute on the first day. At that point, usually the student writes another test, and this test is called a placement test. And that test may share some characteristics with the proficiency test, except the proficiency test is really quite high stakes if you think about it. That proficiency test, the score on that proficiency test determined whether the student was able to come to Canada or not. So the stakes were really high. Typically a placement test, the stakes are a little bit lower. I guess it depends on your perspective. The student might still think it's high stakes, in the sense that the test is used to place the student within that program. So the student has been admitted to the program they're in. Now we want to make sure that we place them in the proper ESL class so that they're in with colleagues of a similar level and they'll all use a similar level of textbook, and we want to know which level that student needs to go into. So they'll write a placement test. Again, usually the placement test will encompass reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And the score here is intended for the student and for the program administrators, and they're going to place that student in the level, usually a 1 or 2 or 3 or 400, or level 1 to 6, or however many levels your program has. So that's a placement test. The next kind of test they might write is they've been placed, let's say, in a level 200 class, and as part of their program they go to an oral skills class. In that oral skills class on the first day, the teacher may ask them to run through a series of drills or to even record themselves so that the student has an initial sample of how they are performing in their speaking skills. And the teacher may listen to this very carefully. This may constitute a diagnostic test. And you'll notice that the range of the skills that are tested in a diagnostic test are usually much narrower. So in the case of an oral skills class, the oral skills will be the skills that are tested and not the writing skills and not the listening skills or not the reading skills. It will be an oral skills diagnostic test. And so the test will be done to determine fluency, pronunciation across segmentals and suprasegmentals, so your vowels and your consonants, as well as your intonation and your rhythm, those kinds of things the teacher will be looking for. And the purpose of a diagnostic test is not to stream students into a specific level, because of course that's already been done, but is to determine the individual's strengths and weaknesses within that particular skill. And so, although the student, of course, will be interested in the outcome of that particular diagnostic test, the other person who really finds that information useful is the teacher, so that the teacher knows where the student's strengths and weaknesses are, and perhaps begins to develop an idea of the kinds of things his or her students really need first, what things need to be addressed over the course of the term, and perhaps how best to group students according to strengths and weaknesses. So that's the purpose of a diagnostic test, and that would usually occur within the first day or the week of the program beginning. Now, as the student moves through that particular course, they may find that around midterm it's coming up test time again, and so they may write a midterm test. And we think of midterms and other types of classroom tests that are offered during the term, we think of those as formative tests. And we call them formative because the goal of these particular tests is to provide feedback for the student so the student can learn better. The student gets an idea of his or her strengths and weaknesses and some pathway forward, some feedback on the pathway forward that they can use to improve their skills in that particular area. And we call it formative because the purpose of the test is to help form the student proficiency in that particular skill. So that's why we call that a formative test. Finally, as the student moves through the term and approaches the end of term, usually there's an exam or a final test, and we call those kinds of tests or exams, we call them achievement tests or summative tests. And the goal there is to measure how much the student has learned throughout the course of the term. So it's a very evaluative type of test. The goal is not really to form student experience or to encourage student proficiency in the sense it's not a future-looking type of test. It's a test that provides a snapshot of proficiency of the student at that particular time. And so that we call a summative test. It's important to understand the difference between formative and summative tests. And a lot of that difference relates to the end user of that particular information and the timing of the test when the test occurs throughout the term, during the term. So let's talk about formative testing first. For a formative test, the end user of that particular information should be the student. The idea of a formative test, remember, is that it helps to form the student's understanding of their proficiency level and points to a way forward. So formative tests then are typically provide a lot of feedback to the student because that's the purpose of the test, not simply to provide a score, although a score certainly may be given, but to actually provide feedback to the student that will help them improve. Usually with formative tests, the other thing we say about them is that they occur in fairly low stakes contexts, which means that there's not a lot at stake for that student. It's not the student's not going to pass or fail the course based on that score. So we say that it's a low stakes context. And so sometimes then that changes the nature of how we administer the test. At times with a formative test, a teacher may actually try and support student performance in order to get the best understanding of a student's proficiency. And so again, we call this a formative test, and you can see how getting a really accurate picture of the student's proficiency and understanding really where they're at in terms of their skill development can help us provide feedback, which will help the student improve. The terminology, another terminology for a formative test is assessment for learning. And you'll hear that in a lot of research papers. You'll see it. People simply call it AFL. And the idea there is that the assessment is done for the purposes of learning. The opposite to a formative test is a summative test. And summatives are typically high stakes. We said that formatives were usually low stakes. Well, summatives are the opposite. Usually a score that is generated from a summative test determines whether the student passes or fails or gets admitted or isn't admitted. And the end user for that score could be the student. Of course, the student is interested on how he or she did. Often it's for the teacher to determine whether the student has mastered enough of the objectives in order to pass the course. And the score may also be passed on to administrators who may be making further decisions about the progress of that student through the program. So you can see that it is quite a bit high stakes. And when the stakes are high like this, we often administer the test in a very rigorous way. So teachers may not modify how the tests are administered in an effort to create consistency of standards across all students. So just think, for example, if you were administering the oral component of a test, in a formative situation, you may actually provide students with a little bit of help as they're speaking, or perhaps provide them with a word that they can't quite remember. In a summative situation, it's unlikely that the test administrator would do that. Usually the administrator just says, like, in their minds that they cannot possibly give help to the student. The student really has to make it on their own in a summative situation. So the stakes then, for summative tests, the stakes are quite high. We call it a high stakes situation. And another term that you will hear linked to summative assessment is assessment of learning. So the acronym there is AOL. So that's really a distinction, just so that you're aware. Assessment of learning is summative, and assessment for learning is formative. What I'd like to do is define a little more clearly the characteristics of formative tests, or what we call assessment for learning. And those types of assessments or tests are usually interactive in nature, so they involve some interaction between the teacher and the student, which is not particularly surprising. And the goal there is to provide a lot of feedback to the student. And so the extent of the feedback then is quite important. Formative assessments are also consistent with a process approach to learning, and they support the students through multiple drafts, could be through multiple drafts of assessment or of a test. And it's also consistent with the use of self and peer evaluation. So again, these types of assessments or evaluations are consistent with that formative type of test. Formative tests are also designed to encourage student autonomy and to create more a positive feel for the student, to encourage them and to motivate them to learn more. Most of the tests that we develop and administer as teachers throughout the course of the term are formative tests. And our goal there is to provide, as a formative test, the goal is to provide motivation to our students and encouraging feedback. Not to say that all your feedback has to be positive, but the overall outcome, we want very positive washback there. So we want students to be motivated and encouraged to learn more. So we need to think about how we can do this, because really most students don't really enjoy being tested. So let's just think about that. Although students accept testing and assessment and the need for that, to be quite honest, they probably, if they were honest with you, they probably would say that they don't really enjoy it. And so students and teachers as well need to change the way they think about assessment in order to implement an assessment for learning approach to testing and assessment. There are lots of cases where teachers try to be so encouraging and positive that they don't give negative comments. Think about perhaps an oral skills class where a student has just given a presentation and the peers have perhaps given some feedback on that presentation, and now it's the teacher's turn. And as the teacher, you know that the student has made some very serious pronunciation errors which have interfered with the understanding of that particular presentation. What do you do? Do you tell the student that in front of all the other students? If you did that, would you be concerned that the student might feel badly about how their presentation went and they may be demotivated? So that's something you need to think about as a teacher when you're providing feedback. Perhaps you would opt to not say too much about the worst kinds of errors that you feel might cause the student embarrassment, but you might pull them aside afterwards when you get a chance to speak with them one-on-one, or you may talk to them outside in the hall. These kinds of methods of providing feedback then are not really consistent with an assessment for learning approach. What we really need to do is to change the way we think about assessment, and so it's a changing paradigm that must be addressed as we move towards a context that's more oriented towards assessment for learning. Another term that you'll hear when people are talking about assessment and testing is the term dynamic assessment. And this is a relatively new term to our field. And the idea of dynamic assessment is that teachers can vary the inputs to a student during the course of a test in order to get a more accurate snapshot of student proficiency at that particular time. This is consistent with a formative approach to assessment. One example of this would be perhaps during a placement test where a teacher administering the oral component of that particular placement test would speak to a student, and they would ask the standard question that's on their test that they are required to ask the student, and perhaps the student would reply. Perhaps the teacher is listening for a specific verb tense. So the question was asked perhaps in the past, and the student is asked to respond in the past. Let's say the student responds right away and uses the past tense correctly. Well, then the teacher would probably move on to the next question and continue on with that type of assessment. But what would happen if the student answered the question and did not speak in the past? In a summative type of test, the teacher would just say, well, the student did not use the past tense in that sentence, and that demonstrates that the student hasn't mastered the past tense, and we are going to move on with the next question. But in dynamic assessment, the teacher would reformulate the question or try a different question also in the past tense and try and prompt the student further to see if the student could actually use the past tense, and may even go so far as to try and vary the question to see whether the student has mastery of irregular past tense verbs but not regular past tense verbs, or vice versa. I guess that would be a little bit more unusual. But the teacher would follow up and vary the inputs, so those inputs would not be consistent across all the students. But because the teacher varied the inputs, they would get a better idea of exactly how proficient that student might be, and they may be, as a result, able to make a more accurate placement in that particular assessment. To summarize then, there's a variety of different types of assessments and tests, and we talked about quite a few of them. We talked about a standardized assessment, we talked about a placement assessment and a diagnostic assessment. We talked also about the differences between formative and summative tests and assessments, and we talked about the new terminology, dynamic assessment. I hope this will help you with your assessment and testing decisions.